A husband walks out on his pregnant wife and their young daughter to marry her best friend, blind to the fact that the woman he's abandoning secretly owns a multi-billion-dollar empire that towers over everything he's ever touched. His pregnant wife, 7 months along, exhausted and supposedly dependent, watches him pack his designer suitcase with trembling hands, her best friend smirking from the doorway of what used to be their family home. The husband, a successful corporate attorney who thinks his six-figure salary makes him indispensable, has no idea that every luxury he's enjoyed, every business deal he's closed, every moment of respect he's commanded has been quietly orchestrated by the pregnant wife he's about to devastate. But what this husband doesn't know, what neither he nor the best friend could ever imagine, is that his pregnant wife built her multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing, hiding behind shell companies and anonymous holdings while playing the role of lithe, devoted housewife. The pregnant wife, who once served him coffee each morning, controls the very industries that employ him, and the husband, who abandons his pregnant wife and daughter for her best friend, is about to discover that leaving wasn't just cruel. It was the most catastrophic mistake of his entire existence. What she did to the husband and the best friend after he abandoned his pregnant wife didn't just leave them devastated. It erased everything they thought they knew about power, wealth, and consequences. But how does a pregnant wife who's been betrayed by both her husband and best friend wield a multi-billion-dollar empire without anyone suspecting? And what exactly did this abandoned pregnant wife unleash that left her husband and former best friend so utterly devastated they'd wish they'd never been born? The morning Daniel Hayes walked out started like any other morning in their Connecticut estate, which meant Catherine was already awake at 5. Morning sickness, twisting her stomach into knots while she prepared breakfast for a husband who barely acknowledged her existence anymore. Her pregnant belly, swollen at 7 months, pressed against the marble counter as she cracked eggs into a pan, the diamond ring on her finger, the one Daniel had chosen from Tiffany's 8 years ago, catching the early light. Their daughter Emma, barely 4 years old, still slept upstairs in a bedroom that cost more than most people's houses, unaware that her father had already decided she wasn't worth staying for. Catherine's phone buzzed with its 5th encrypted message of the morning, each one representing millions of dollars in transactions flowing through companies Daniel had never heard of, wealth accumulating in accounts he couldn't fathom existed. She'd built it all while he was at the office, seducing juries and billing clients, thinking his career defined their lifestyle. The irony was almost funny, almost, if it didn't hurt so much that the man, all she'd loved since college, the one she'd helped through law school by working 3 jobs, now looked at her like she was an obligation he'd finally found the courage to shed. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something the person on the other end said. Catherine recognized that laugh, the one he used to reserve for her back when they were broke, students sharing ramen in a studio apartment, before her secret empire existed, before success changed him into someone who measured worth in billable hours and social connections. He ended the call and poured himself coffee without meeting her eyes, his Brioni suit perfectly tailored, his Patek Philippe watch glinting as he checked the time. Catherine remembered buying him his first nice watch for their anniversary 3 years ago, a modest Tag Heuer she could afford on her cover salary as a freelance consultant. He'd upgraded since then, never questioning where the money came from. When she told him her consulting was doing well, never curious enough to ask which company she consulted for or why her small projects never seemed to interfere with her availability to him and Emma. The man was brilliant in a courtroom but apparently blind in his own home, unable to see that the woman serving him eggs controlled more wealth than his entire law firm generated in a decade. "I need to talk to you," Daniel said, setting his coffee cup down with a clink that sounded too final. Catherine felt her heart accelerate, that instinct she'd honed in boardrooms, triggering even here, in her own kitchen, facing the man whose child currently kicked against her ribs. She'd known something was coming, had known for months, actually, ever since she'd noticed the way he looked at Jessica, her best friend since college, the maid of honor at their wedding, the woman Catherine had trusted with her daughter during countless business trips she disguised as spa weekends. The betrayal, and had been building like a storm she could see on every horizon, and Catherine had watched it approach with the same analytical detachment she used when hostile competitors made moves against her holdings. She'd run scenarios, calculated probabilities, prepared contingencies, but preparation didn't stop the knife from cutting when it finally struck. "I'm leaving," Daniel continued, and there it was, the words delivered like a verdict he'd rehearsed. "Jessica and I have been seeing each other for 8 months. We're in love. I'm filing for divorce next week." Catherine's hand found the counter's edge, steadying herself against both the shock and the complete absence of shock. That strange duality of knowing something and still being gutted when it happened. 8 months meant it started right after she'd gotten pregnant, right after they'd celebrated Emma's 3rd birthday, right after he'd told her he wanted their family to grow. Behind Daniel, movement in the hallway caught Catherine's attention. Jessica emerged from the shadows, wearing one of Catherine's robes, her dark hair tousled, her smile sharp and victorious. The best friend who'd borrowed money to start her marketing business 3 years ago, money Catherine had provided through an anonymous investor because Jessica's pride wouldn't accept direct help. The best friend who'd vacationed with them in the Maldives, who'd held Emma as a newborn, who'd sworn at their wine-soaked freshman year gatherings that sisters before misters was forever. Forever apparently lasted until Jessica decided she wanted Catherine's husband more than she valued their 2 decades of friendship. "The house is yours," Daniel said, as if he was being generous, as if he wasn't aware that Catherine had purchased this estate through a holding company 2 years before she'd even suggested they move here, letting him believe his partnership bonus had made it possible. "I'll want joint custody of Emma, of course, and the baby." He glanced at her stomach like it was a problem. He was still calculating how to solve. "We'll figure that out after it's born." Jessica moved to Daniel's side, slipping her hand into his with practiced intimacy, and Catherine saw her entire life, the real one, and the carefully constructed facade split into 2 irreconcilable realities. In one reality, she was Catherine Hayes, abandoned pregnant wife and mother, facing single parenthood and the judgment that would come when their social circle learned her husband had left her for her best friend. In the other reality, she was Catherine Jo. She'd never legally changed her name. Another detail. Daniel had never bothered to confirm CEO and principal shareholder of Jo Holdings, an umbrella corporation controlling interests in everything from pharmaceutical patents to commercial real estate, from technology startups to media conglomerates, a multi-billion-dollar empire she'd built by being smarter, more ruthless, and infinitely more strategic than anyone who'd ever underestimated her. Daniel pulled a suitcase from the hallway closet, one Catherine recognized because she'd given it to him for Christmas, and started loading his things with efficient movements that suggested he'd been planning this exit for a while. "My lawyer will contact yours," he said, still not meeting her eyes, as if eye contact might trigger guilt he wasn't interested in feeling. "I think we can keep this civil. For Emma's sake." Civil. The word hung in the air like a threat disguised as courtesy. Catherine watched her husband of 8 years, the father of her daughter and the child currently somersaulting in her womb, walk toward the door with her former best friend trailing behind him, and something inside her that had been soft, that had believed in love and loyalty and the promises people made, crystallized into something cold and diamond hard. She'd built her empire in secret to protect her family, to ensure Emma and the new baby would never struggle the way Catherine had growing up in a Cleveland housing project, watching her single mother work 3 jobs and still fall short. She'd hidden her success because Daniel's ego couldn't handle a wife who out-earned him, because she'd loved him enough to make herself smaller. But standing in the kitchen of a house she actually owned, watching the man who thought he was abandoning a helpless pregnant wife, Catherine felt that protective instinct shift into something sharper. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Catherine stood in the sudden silence, one hand on her pregnant belly, feeling the baby kick as if in protest. Upstairs, Emma would wake soon, asking for her daddy, and Catherine would have to find words to explain why he wasn't there, why Jessica wouldn't be visiting anymore, why their family had suddenly broken apart. Her phone buzzed again, her CFO, probably, with updates on the Seattle acquisition they were finalizing. Catherine looked at the message, then at the closed door, then at the wedding photo still hanging in the hallway, a snapshot of two naive kids who'd thought love was enough. She'd given Daniel everything, including the illusion that he was the successful one, the provider, the one holding their life together. Now he was gone, and the only thing Catherine felt besides the grief was a strange, cold clarity about what came next. She'd been playing defense her entire marriage, hiding, diminishing, pretending. But Daniel and Jessica had just made the fatal mistake of thinking the pregnant wife they devastated was powerless. They'd forgotten the first rule of warfare that Catherine had learned building her empire from nothing. The most dangerous opponent is the one whose strength you never see coming. And they were about to learn exactly what a multi-billion-dollar empire looked like when it stopped being a secret and started being a weapon. 3 weeks after Daniel left, Catherine sat in the penthouse office. She maintained under an LLC so opaque that even forensic accountants would need months to trace it back to her, reviewing the preliminary reports her team had compiled on every aspect of her husband's and former best friends' lives. The view from the 72nd floor overlooked Manhattan like a kingdom she'd conquered without anyone noticing, glass and steel and power that existed completely separately from the suburban Connecticut life where she was supposedly just a abandoned pregnant wife struggling to cope. Morning sickness had finally eased into the third trimester, and Catherine found she could think clearly again, could focus on the intricate chess game she was about to play with people who didn't even know they were pieces on her board. Her daughter Emma was with Catherine's mother, the one person who knew the truth about everything, who'd watched her daughter build this empire while pretending to be someone smaller, someone safer, someone men like Daniel Hayes could handle being married to. Marcus Chen, her CFO and the closest thing she had to a friend in the legitimate business world, spread documents across the conference table with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Hayes and Partners has 3 major clients that account for 60% of their annual revenue, Marcus explained, his voice carrying that particular satisfaction that came when you held information that could end someone's career. Quantum Technologies, Meridian Pharma, and Castellan Media Group. All 3 are Zhou Holdings subsidiaries, though Hayes has no idea. He thinks he landed those clients through his brilliant legal strategies and reputation. Marcus paused, allowing himself a slight smile. He doesn't know his wife is the one who directed those companies to hire his firm 3 years ago. Catherine remembered making that decision, watching Daniel's confidence grow as his career took off, never suspecting that his wife had engineered his success, because she'd wanted him to feel important, to feel like the provider he needed to be. The man's ego had been so fragile that Catherine had restructured corporate legal needs across 3 major companies just to feed it. Looking back, that might have been her first mistake, not the generosity itself, but the assumption that making Daniel feel successful would make him loyal. What about Jessica? Catherine asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her pregnant belly, where the baby, another girl, she'd learned at her last ultrasound seemed to be doing gymnastics. Marcus pulled up another file, this one thinner but no less damaging. Morrison Marketing has 12 clients. 8 of them came through referrals you orchestrated, though she doesn't know that either. Her business exists because you built it for her. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, remembering the lunch 2 years ago when Jessica had confessed she was failing, that her marketing startup was drowning in debt, that she might have to shut down and go back to corporate work she'd hated. Catherine had spent that evening creating an intricate web of referrals, convincing Zhou Holdings portfolio companies that they needed fresh marketing perspectives, making sure Jessica's proposals always landed on the right desks at the right moments. Within 6 months, Morrison Marketing had gone from near bankruptcy to thriving, and Jessica had credited her own talent and persistence, never questioning why success had come so suddenly after years of struggle. The betrayal hurt worse than Daniel's somehow. Catherine had expected men to disappoint her, had watched her mother's boyfriends come and go throughout her childhood, each one proving that masculine loyalty was conditional at best. But Jessica had been different, or so Catherine had thought. They'd met freshman year at NYU, both of them scholarship kids trying to navigate a world of wealth they didn't understand. bonding over ramen noodles and dreams of escaping the poverty they'd grown up in. Jessica had been there when Catherine's mother got sick, had helped her study for finals while Catherine worked night shifts to pay hospital bills, had sworn they'd always take care of each other. Apparently that promise had an expiration date, triggered by a husband Jessica wanted more than she valued 2 decades of friendship. Catherine wondered when exactly the decision had happened. At which dinner party or play date or casual coffee meeting, Jessica had looked at Daniel and thought, I want that with enough conviction to destroy everything. The psychology of it fascinated Catherine in an abstract way. How people could compartmentalize betrayal, convince themselves they deserved something that belonged to someone else, rewrite history until they were the hero of a story where they were clearly the villain. There's more, Marcus said, his tone shifting into something cautious. Catherine looked up from the reports, noting the way her CFO's expression had changed from satisfaction to concern. Hayes filed the divorce papers yesterday. He's asking for full custody of Emma and, quote, appropriate financial support given the disparity in earning potential. Catherine felt something cold settle in her chest, that mama bear instinct that had driven every decision she'd made since Emma was born 4 years ago. He thinks I'm broke, she said quietly, understanding the strategy immediately. Daniel believed Catherine had been living off his income, that her consulting work was just a hobby generating pocket money at best. In his mind, she was a stay-at-home mother who'd gotten comfortable, and now that he was leaving, she'd need his financial support to survive. The arrogance of it was almost impressive. He's planning to paint you as an unfit mother, Marcus confirmed. The filings mention your emotional instability and suggest that joint custody with him as primary guardian would be in Emma's best interest. Jessica has apparently agreed to help raise both children. Both children. The baby Catherine was currently carrying, the one Daniel had helped create 3 weeks before he started sleeping with her best friend, was already being reassigned in his mind to the new family he was building with Jessica. Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd conquered while playing housewife in Connecticut. Somewhere down there, Daniel was probably in his office at Hayes & Partners, billing some client $900 an hour for legal advice, thinking he was powerful, thinking he was winning, thinking the pregnant wife he'd abandoned was devastated and helpless. The thought brought a smile to Catherine's face that Marcus would later describe as the most terrifying expression he'd ever seen on a human being. Start phase 1, Catherine said, her voice calm and certain. I want Quantum Technologies to announce they're moving their legal work in-house. Have them thank Hayes & Partners for their service, but explain that the company is restructuring its legal department for cost efficiency. Marcus nodded, already pulling up his phone to make calls. Meridian Pharma and Castellan Media? He asked. 2 weeks after Quantum, Catherine decided, her mind running through scenarios and timelines with the strategic precision that had built her empire. Space them out enough that it seems like coincidence, not coordination. Let him scramble to replace the revenue. Let him feel the ground shifting under his feet without understanding why. The plan was more sophisticated than simple revenge, though Catherine wasn't above admitting that revenge was part of the satisfaction. She'd spent 8 years making Daniel Hayes feel successful, and now she was going to spend 8 weeks showing him what success actually looked like, what power really meant, who had actually been holding up the life he'd taken for granted. But more than that, she was going to make sure her daughters, Emma, and the baby girl currently using her bladder as a punching bag, never grew up thinking their father had been the important one. Never internalized the lie that men who abandoned pregnant wives got to define the narrative. Catherine had built her empire in secret to protect her family, but now that the family was broken, the empire was going to become very, very visible. And everyone who'd underestimated the abandoned pregnant wife was going to learn exactly why that had been a mistake they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting. The best part, the detail that brought Catherine the most cold satisfaction, was that Daniel and Jessica still had no idea what was coming. They were celebrating their victory, probably planning their wedding, certainly congratulating themselves on escaping a marriage they decided was beneath them. They didn't know that the woman they devastated controlled the very ground they stood on, that every success they'd achieved had been built on Catherine's invisible foundation, that she could take it all away with a phone call and a smile. But they were about to find out. 6 weeks after Daniel left, he sat in his office at Hayes and Partners, staring at financial reports that made absolutely no sense, trying to understand how a law firm that had been thriving 3 months ago was suddenly hemorrhaging clients and revenue like a ship taking on water in a storm no one had predicted. Quantum Technologies had left first, their departure explained with corporate language about restructuring and internal capabilities that Daniel's senior partner said sounded legitimate, even if the timing was unfortunate. Then Meridian Pharma announced they were consolidating their legal work with a larger firm, apologetic but firm in their decision, and suddenly Hayes and Partners was down 40% in annual revenue, with no warning and no clear explanation. Castellan Media Group had just sent the notice this morning effective immediately. They'd be transitioning to new legal representation. Thank you for your service. No further discussion necessary. 3 of their 4 biggest clients, gone in 6 weeks, and Daniel was fielding questions from partners who were starting to look at him like he was the liability that had brought this disaster. His phone buzzed with another text from Jessica, something about paint colors for the condo they just leased in Tribeca, and Daniel found himself irritated by her trivial concerns when his entire career was imploding. The condo had been Jessica's idea, a fresh start in the city where they could be a real couple without the suburban judgment Catherine's friends would inevitably levy. It had seemed romantic when they'd signed the lease 3 weeks ago, exciting even, proof that leaving Catherine had been the right decision. Now Daniel looked at the monthly rent, $12,000 for 2 bedrooms and a view, and felt the first whisper of anxiety about money, about obligations, about the divorce settlement that was starting to look more expensive than he'd calculated when he'd assumed his career trajectory would continue upward. Catherine's lawyer had filed a counter petition that shocked him with its aggression, demanding full custody of Emma, requesting child support that seemed unreasonable given Catherine's lack of income, and refusing every compromise Daniel's attorney suggested. The woman who'd always been so accommodating, so eager to please, had apparently found a spine now that he'd left her. "Hayes, we need to talk." Richard Morrison, the senior partner, appeared in Daniel's doorway with an expression that Daniel recognized from court, the look lawyers got when they were about to deliver bad news they'd rather avoid. Daniel gestured to the chair, his stomach sinking because he knew what was coming. Had been expecting this conversation since Castellan's departure this morning made the pattern impossible to ignore. "The firm is concerned about the client losses," Richard said, settling into the chair with the careful posture of a man choosing his words precisely. 3 major clients in 6 weeks isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern. We need to understand what's happening. Daniel spread his hands in frustration, the gesture of an innocent man confronted with inexplicable circumstances. "I don't know," he admitted, and that was the terrifying truth. He genuinely had no idea why this was happening. "My client relationships were solid. I delivered excellent work. There were no complaints, no disputes, nothing that would explain this." Richard studied him with the expression of a senior partner, evaluating whether a junior was worth saving, and Daniel felt something like panic flutter in his chest. He'd been at Hayes and Partners for 6 years, had made partner 3 years ago in what everyone said was a meteoric rise, had built a reputation as one of the most effective corporate attorneys in the tri-state area. His career had been perfect, his trajectory unstoppable, his future secured. Except now, 3 of his 4 biggest clients had vanished like smoke, and he was sitting in his corner office wondering how long he'd still have the corner office, wondering if the partnership he'd worked so hard to achieve was about to be rescinded. "We're putting you on probation," Richard said finally, the words landing like a sentence. 3 months to rebuild your client base and demonstrate you can still generate revenue. If you can't, he left the alternative unspoken. But Daniel heard it clearly enough. If he couldn't recover, he'd be asked to leave the firm, which in the legal world meant his career was essentially over. No other major firm would hire a partner who'd been forced out, and starting his own practice would require capital and clients he didn't have. Daniel sat alone in his office after Richard left, looking at the photos on his desk. Emma at 3 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. A wedding photo he should probably remove but hadn't gotten around to packing yet. His law school diploma from Columbia. He'd worked so hard to get here, grinding through law school while Catherine worked those mysterious consulting jobs that somehow paid their rent, building his reputation case by case, finally achieving the success he'd always wanted. And now it was crumbling, and he didn't understand why. Couldn't see the pattern or the cause or the solution. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that the timing was suspicious, his career imploding right after he'd left Catherine. But Daniel dismissed the thought as paranoid. Catherine was just a housewife with some freelance consulting work, not someone with the power or connections to orchestrate corporate legal decisions. The idea was absurd, wasn't it? His phone rang, and Daniel saw Jessica's name, debated not answering, because he didn't have the energy for another conversation about curtains or furniture, or the domestic details she seemed obsessed with lately. But he picked up anyway, because Jessica was his future now, the choice he'd made, the life he was building. "Daniel, we have a problem." Jessica's voice came through tight with stress, and Daniel felt his stomach drop further, because apparently the universe had decided today was the day for everything to go wrong simultaneously. Morrison Marketing just lost 4 clients. 4. In 2 days. They're all saying they're going in a different direction. But Daniel, these were stable relationships. Something's happening. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the first real thread of fear pull tight in his chest. Jessica losing clients the same way he was losing clients, both of their careers suddenly imploding in parallel, and that small paranoid voice got louder, asking questions Daniel didn't want to consider. "It's probably just coincidence," he said, trying to convince himself as much as Jessica. "Markets fluctuate, clients make changes. It happens." But Jessica wasn't buying it any more than he was. 4 clients in 2 days, Daniel. The same week you lost Castellan. This isn't coincidence. This is... She paused, and he could hear her breathing, could feel her fear through the phone line. This is deliberate. Later that night, lying awake in the hotel room he'd been staying in since leaving the house, the Tribeca condo wouldn't be ready for another 3 weeks. Daniel found himself thinking about Catherine in ways he'd been avoiding since he left. Not the Catherine he'd convinced himself she was. The boring suburban housewife whose conversation revolved around Emma's preschool and grocery shopping, but the Catherine he'd met in college, brilliant and hungry, and determined to escape the poverty she'd grown up in. That Catherine had worked 3 jobs while pulling straight A's in economics, had managed his entire life so he could focus on law school, had somehow always had money when they needed it, even though her jobs shouldn't have paid that well. Daniel had never questioned it, had been too focused on his own ambitions to wonder about the details of Catherine's life. Now, lying in the dark with his career collapsing and Jessica's panic fresh in his mind, he found himself wondering what he'd missed, what he'd been too arrogant or too oblivious to see. The wondering kept him awake until dawn, and when his phone buzzed with a news alert at 6 a.m., Daniel picked it up with exhausted dread, somehow knowing before he read it that whatever the news was, it was going to make everything worse. Joe Holdings announces major expansion, the headline read, and Daniel scrolled past it, not caring about some tech conglomerate's business moves, not understanding yet that he was looking at the name of his own destruction, not recognizing that the empire about to devastate him had been built by the pregnant wife he'd abandoned. The revelation came not with dramatic flair, but with quiet, crushing certainty, the way truth often arrives when you've been avoiding it long enough that it finally corners you with nowhere left to run. Daniel was in his office, still his office, though the probation deadline was approaching and he'd failed to land a single new client in 2 months when Jessica called, her voice shaking in a way he'd never heard before. "Daniel, you need to see this," she said, and something in her tone made his hands go cold. "I'm sending you a link. Look at it now." The article she'd sent was from the Wall Street Journal, a profile piece on successful female CEOs, and the woman in the photo was Catherine. Not Catherine Hayes, suburban housewife from Connecticut, but Catherine Joe, founder and CEO of Joe Holdings, one of the largest privately held conglomerates in North America, estimated net worth somewhere north of $8 billion. The article detailed her rise from poverty in Cleveland to business school at Wharton. Daniel had never known she went to Wharton, had thought she studied at NYU with Jessica, to building an empire that spanned pharmaceuticals, technology, media, and real estate. The profile mentioned her philanthropic work, her reputation for strategic brilliance, her ruthless efficiency in business dealings. It mentioned her two daughters, Emma, age 4, and Charlotte, born 3 weeks ago, and described her as a single mother who'd recently divorced. It mentioned nothing about the husband who'd left her while she was pregnant, nothing about the best friend who'd betrayed her, nothing about the personal devastation that had preceded this very public reveal of Catherine's secret identity. Daniel read the article 3 times, each pass making him feel smaller, stupider, more completely destroyed. $8 billion. Catherine had $8 billion. Catherine owned Quantum Technologies, Meridian Pharma, Castellan Media Group, all the clients who'd left him, all the revenue that had evaporated, all the success he'd thought he'd earned through his own merit. Catherine had built his career, had orchestrated his rise, had made him feel important while holding the actual power herself. And he'd left her, while she was pregnant, for her best friend. Daniel thought he might vomit, his entire self-conception crumbling into rubble as he understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he'd condescended to, the wife he'd treated like an accessory to his important life, the mother he was trying to paint as unfit in custody proceedings. She was one of the most successful business people in the country, and he'd been too arrogant and oblivious to notice. His phone rang again. Jessica and Daniel almost didn't answer because what could they possibly say to each other that would make this better? But he picked up, and Jessica was crying, her words tumbling over themselves in panic. "Morrison Marketing is done," she said. "I just got served with breach of contract lawsuits from 3 former clients, all claiming I misrepresented my capabilities and delivered substandard work. Daniel, these are companies I worked with for 2 years, relationships that were fine until 2 weeks ago. This is Catherine. This has to be Catherine. She's destroying us." The truth of it hit Daniel like a physical blow. Yes, this was Catherine, or rather this was Catherine Joe, and she wasn't destroying them so much as revealing what had always been true, that everything they'd built, every success they'd celebrated, every achievement they'd claimed had been constructed on her invisible foundation. Take away that foundation, and they simply collapsed into what they'd always actually been: a moderately talented lawyer and a decent but unremarkable marketer who'd been lifted far above their natural level by a woman they'd both betrayed. "We need to talk to her," Daniel said, though the idea of facing Catherine now made him want to disappear into the ground. "We need to explain, to apologize, to what? To beg forgiveness for destroying their marriage, abandoning her while pregnant, stealing her best friend, and then trying to take custody of her daughter? What possible explanation could he offer that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was? The pathetic excuses of a man who'd finally realized he'd thrown away something irreplaceable for something worthless. Jessica made a noise that might have been agreement or despair, and they ended the call without any real plan, both of them drowning in the consequences of choices that had seemed so clear 2 months ago. Daniel pulled up Catherine's contact in his phone, that familiar number he'd called 1,000 times during their marriage, and stared at it for 10 minutes before finding the courage to dial. The phone rang 4 times, and Daniel was almost relieved when it went to voicemail, except the voicemail was a professional greeting in Catherine's voice, calm and controlled, and nothing like the woman he'd thought he'd married. "You've reached Catherine Joe, CEO of Joe Holdings. Please leave a message, and my assistant will return your call during business hours." That night, Daniel did something he hadn't done since leaving. He drove to the Connecticut house that Catherine had said was his, but which he now understood had always been hers, had always been purchased with her money, had always been another gift from a woman who'd loved him enough to hide her power so his ego could survive. The house was dark except for a single light in what used to be their bedroom, and Daniel sat in his car in the driveway, her driveway, trying to find words that might make this right. Emma's bike was on the front lawn, and he felt his throat tighten, thinking about his daughter, about how he'd planned to take her away from Catherine, about the custody battle that now seemed grotesquely presumptuous. Finally, he got out of the car and walked to the door, rang the bell like a stranger, because he didn't have keys anymore, waited, in the October cold, for someone to answer. The door opened, and Catherine stood there, 9 days postpartum, holding baby Charlotte in her arms, looking at him with an expression so completely neutral that it was more devastating than anger would have been. "Catherine," Daniel started, and found he didn't know what came next, didn't have a speech prepared because what could he possibly say? "I read the article. I understand now. Catherine shifted Charlotte slightly, the baby making soft noises against her shoulder, and waited for Daniel to finish. When he didn't, she spoke instead, her voice that same calm, professional tone from the voicemail. "Did you come here to apologize, Daniel? To explain why you abandoned your pregnant wife for her best friend? To beg me to restore your clients? To save your career? To pretend the last 2 months didn't happen?" Each question landed like a surgical strike, cutting away the excuses Daniel had been trying to construct. "I came to tell you, I was wrong," he said, which was true but hopelessly inadequate. "I made a terrible mistake. I threw away everything that mattered. I'm sorry." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel saw something in her eyes, not anger, not hatred, but something far worse. Pity, mixed with complete indifference, the way you might look at someone who used to matter but didn't anymore. "You weren't wrong, Daniel," Catherine said quietly. "You were exactly who you always were. I was wrong for hiding myself to make you feel bigger. I was wrong for building your career because your ego couldn't handle having a successful wife. I was wrong for thinking love meant making myself smaller." She stepped back slightly, preparing to close the door. "Your clients are gone because they were never yours to begin with. Your success was built on my foundation, and when you broke the foundation, the structure collapsed. That's not revenge, Daniel. That's just architecture." Daniel felt panic rising, because this couldn't be it, couldn't be the end, couldn't be Catherine just closing the door on 8 years of marriage without offering him any path back. "What about us?" he asked desperately. "What about our family? What about Emma and Charlotte?" Catherine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been pain, or might have been the memory of pain she'd already processed and moved past. "Emma and Charlotte have a mother who owns a multi-billion-dollar empire and will make sure they never want for anything," she said. "What they don't have anymore is a father who valued them. You made that choice, Daniel. You chose Jessica. So go back to Jessica and figure out what your life looks like now that I'm not holding it up." The door closed, and Daniel stood on the porch. Catherine's porch, bought with Catherine's money, a part of Catherine's empire, listening to his baby daughter cry inside a house he'd never actually owned. Understanding too late and too completely that he'd destroyed the only thing in his life that had ever been real. Inside, he could hear Catherine soothing Charlotte, her voice gentle with their daughter in a way it would never be with him again. And Daniel turned and walked back to his car, back to the hotel room he could barely afford, back to Jessica, who was somewhere drowning in her own devastation, and felt the full weight of what he'd lost finally crush him completely. The abandoned pregnant wife hadn't just left him devastated, she'd shown him exactly who he'd always been without her. And the reflection was so pathetic, so small, so utterly insufficient that Daniel knew he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget it. But he wouldn't forget. That was Catherine's real revenge. Not the destroyed career or the public humiliation or the financial ruin, but the certain knowledge that he'd thrown away something irreplaceable and would spend every remaining day knowing exactly what he'd lost and why he'd never deserved to get it back.